In March 1917, the Tsar of Russia abdicated. That night, thousands gathered at Carnegie Hall in New York to celebrate. A telegram was read aloud from one of the most powerful bankers in America. He called the fall of the Tsar, in his own words, printed the next morning in the New York Times. What we had hoped and striven for, these long years. His name was Jacob Schiff. He was the head of Kuhn Loeb and Company, the second most powerful investment bank in the United States. And what he had striven for did not begin in 1917. It began 13 years earlier. In 1904, Schiff committed $200 million to Japan's war against Russia. He then spent 15 years systematically blocking every Russian government bond offering that reached Western capital markets. He funded networks that distributed revolutionary material to tens of thousands of Russian prisoners of war. He coordinated with European banks to deny the Tsar access to the capital he needed to survive. His motivation was documented and personal. The Tsarist government had persecuted Jewish communities across the empire for 3 decades through organized pogroms, expulsions, and legal restrictions that left millions of people with no rights and no recourse. Schiff watched from New York and chose to act using the only instrument he controlled: money. The New York Times printed his telegram. The Japanese finance minister documented their meetings in his memoirs. The paper trail is open. And what it shows is a financial operation so precisely targeted and so systematically executed that when the Tsar finally fell in March 1917, it was not entirely a surprise to the man who had spent 15 years engineering the conditions that made it possible. This is that documented story. Jacob Schiff was born in Frankfurt in 1847 into a family with deep roots in the Jewish banking community of Germany. He arrived in New York in 1865 at the age of 18 and joined Kuhn Loeb in 1875. By the 1890s, he had built it into the primary competitor to J.P. Morgan in American railroad finance. The two firms between them controlled the capital flows that built the American industrial economy. To understand the specific power Schiff wielded it is necessary to understand what investment banking meant in the 1890s. American railroads required enormous amounts of capital, more than any individual investor could supply. Investment banks assembled syndicates of investors, structured the bond offerings, and distributed them to the market. The railroads could not be built without the banks. The banks that controlled railroad financing controlled the physical infrastructure of the American economy. Kuhn Loeb under Schiff financed the reorganization of the Union Pacific Railroad in 1897 and the Northern Pacific in 1901, two of the most significant railroad transactions of the era. J.P. Morgan handled the other major lines. The two men divided the American railroad system between them and in doing so accumulated a level of financial influence that had no equivalent in any other democratic country. The rivalry between Schiff and Morgan reached its most dramatic expression on the 9th of May, 1901. Schiff was working with the railroad magnate E.H. Harriman to acquire control of the Northern Pacific Railroad from Morgan. Both sides bought shares simultaneously, Schiff and Harriman purchasing from the open market, Morgan's representatives purchasing to defend their position. The simultaneous buying from two of the most powerful financial forces in America caused a supply crisis in Northern Pacific shares. Traders who had sold the stock short, betting its price would fall, found themselves unable to buy the shares they needed to cover their positions. The price of Northern Pacific shares rose from $100 to $1,000 in a single day. To raise cash to cover their Northern Pacific positions, traders sold everything else they held. The broader market collapsed. The Northern Pacific Corner, as it became known, was the most spectacular single-day financial crisis in American history to that point. The episode confirmed beyond any doubt that Jacob Schiff operated at the absolute apex of American financial power. Schiff was not a peripheral figure. He sat on the boards of the National City Bank of New York, the Equitable Life Assurance Society, and Wells Fargo. He was a director of institutions that between them controlled a significant fraction of American financial life. When he decided to use that position against the Tsar of Russia, he was not acting as an outsider. He was acting from the center of the American financial establishment. What turned Jacob Schiff from a successful banker into a financial warrior against a sovereign empire was a single event in April 1903. In the city of Kishinev, then part of the Russian Empire, now the capital of Moldova, a pogrom lasted 2 days. 49 Jewish residents were killed. 500 were injured. 1,500 homes were destroyed. The violence was organized. Local police stood aside. The provincial governor took no action. When the news reached New York, the Jewish community understood immediately that this was not a random outburst. It was state-sanctioned. The Tsar's government had allowed it to happen because anti-Jewish violence served as a pressure valve for popular discontent. The Kishinev pogrom was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of 3 decades of systematic persecution. The May laws of 1882 had restricted where Jewish citizens could live, what occupations they could enter, and what educational institutions they could attend. The Pale of Settlement confined the majority of Russian Jews to a specific geographic area in western Russia and Ukraine. Periodic pogroms had been occurring since the 1880s, state-tolerated violence against Jewish communities that the Tsar's government used to deflect popular anger away from the regime. Between 1881 and 1914, approximately 2 million Jews left Russia for the United States. They were not emigrants seeking opportunity. They were refugees fleeing systematic state violence. Schiff had been monitoring this situation for years. He had already served on the commission that President Benjamin Harrison established to investigate the wave of Jewish emigration from Russia in the 1890s. He had given money to relief organizations. He had lobbied American politicians to pressure the Russian government diplomatically. He had worked through every conventional channel available to a private citizen. None of it had made any difference. Diplomatic pressure produced polite notes and continued persecution. Schiff concluded that the only language the Tsarist regime would respond to was financial pressure at a scale it could not ignore. 7 months after Kishinev, Japan and Russia went to war. If you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. This is exactly the kind of documented financial history we cover. The mechanisms behind the events that shaped the modern world. Here is what the documents now establish. A banker who had spent a decade watching diplomatic pressure fail decided that the Russo-Japanese War was not just a conflict between 2 empires. It was an opportunity. Japan needed capital to fight. Russia needed capital to survive. Schiff could supply one and deny the other, simultaneously. What followed was not an impulsive act of sentiment. It was a calculated 2-track financial operation documented in the private correspondence and diaries of the men who conducted it. In the spring of 1904, Takahashi Kurokiyo, deputy governor of the Bank of Japan, was in London trying to raise money for Japan's war effort. He had been turned down by almost every major British banking house. The City of London was reluctant to back an Asian power in a war against a European empire. Takahashi was running out of options. At a dinner in London, he found himself seated next to Jacob Schiff. What happened at that dinner is documented in Takahashi's own memoirs. The 2 men talked through the evening. Schiff asked about the war. Takahashi explained Japan's financial position. Schiff asked one question that Takahashi remembered for the rest of his life: whether Japan would guarantee equal civil rights to Jews living in Japanese-controlled territory. Takahashi said yes. Schiff made his decision. Within days, Schiff had committed Kuhn Loeb to the first Japanese war bond offering, £10 million at 6%. It was the first major flotation of Japanese bonds on Wall Street. No other American bank had moved. Schiff moved alone. His motivation was stated plainly in his own correspondence to Lord Revelstoke of Baring Brothers, who had passed on the deal, the desire to help Russian Jews by weakening the regime that was persecuting them. The first loan was followed by 3 more. In October 1904, Schiff underwrote a second offering of £12 million at terms even less favorable to Japan than the first, because Japan's military position was still uncertain and the market demanded a risk premium. In April 1905, he led a third offering, as Japan's military victories began to shift market sentiment. In July 1905, a fourth offering came at significantly better terms as Japan's naval victory at Tsushima, where the Japanese fleet destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet after it had sailed halfway around the world, had removed all serious doubt about the war's outcome. Each offering required Schiff to build a new syndicate. European banks that had declined the first offering joined the later ones as Japan's prospects became clearer. The Rothschild House, which had initially stayed out citing uncertainty about Japanese prospects, participated in the later tranches. Schiff had turned the first Japanese bond offering from a transaction every major bank had refused into the foundation of a syndicate that eventually included institutions across 3 continents. By the end of the war, Kuhn Loeb had underwritten the equivalent of $200 million in Japanese war bonds, approximately half of Japan's total external war financing. The money paid for the munitions, the ships, and the supplies that allowed Japan to fight the war to a conclusion. The documentation of these transactions is in multiple archives. Takahashi's diary records each meeting with Schiff in detail. The Rothschild archive in London holds telegrams between Kuhn Loeb and Baring Brothers discussing the loan syndication. The Schiff papers at the American Jewish Archives contain his correspondence with Japanese officials throughout the war. After the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 and the subsequent wave of pogroms in 1905, approximately 1.5 million Jews left Russia for America. Schiff personally organized and funded the infrastructure to receive them. He created an alternative immigration entry point through Galveston, Texas, to distribute arrivals across the American interior, rather than concentrating them in the already overcrowded Lower East Side of New York. He funded resettlement programs, employment assistance, and the institutional infrastructure of the largest single migration in American Jewish history. The scale of what he was managing tells you the scale of what he was responding to. The financial war against the Tsar was not an abstraction. It was a response to a documented human catastrophe that was arriving on American shores at the rate of hundreds of thousands of people per year. Japan awarded Schiff the Second Order of the Rising Sun in recognition of his role in financing the victory. In 1906, Schiff visited Japan and was received as a guest of honor. He dined with Emperor Meiji, one of the very few Westerners ever extended that specific invitation. The Japanese press covered the visit extensively. A private banker from Wall Street was being received by the Japanese imperial court with the protocol extended to a foreign head of state because of what his $200 million had meant to Japan's survival as a modern power. Schiff wrote afterwards that Japan's victory was a cause not just for Japan, but for the entire civilized world, his exact phrase, because it had demonstrated that an Asian nation could defeat a European empire on equal terms. This is the kind of documented financial history that the standard account almost never tells you directly. If this channel is new to you, subscribe now. We cover the paper trail behind the official version of events. The Japan operation is documented in 4 separate archive collections across 3 countries. But Japan was only the first track of a 2-track financial strategy. While Schiff was supplying Japan with the capital to fight, he was simultaneously deploying a second instrument against Russia, one that operated not on the battlefield, but inside Russian society itself. And the records of that second operation are in a different set of archives entirely. The financial isolation of Russia did not begin with the war. Schiff had been opposing Russian government bond offerings in the American market since the late 1890s. When Russian delegations arrived in New York seeking capital, he used his position and his relationships to close doors. He communicated directly with European banking partners, including the Rothschild houses in London and Paris, to coordinate opposition to Russian borrowing. The Rothschild archive confirms that the London house declined Russian bond business during this period and was in communication with Schiff about the reasons. The specific mechanism was straightforward. When the Russian finance ministry sent representatives to New York to arrange bond offerings, Schiff would contact the major underwriting firms and indicate his opposition. Given his position as head of the second most powerful investment bank in the country and his extensive network of relationships across Wall Street, his opposition carried decisive weight. Bond offerings require a syndicate of underwriters to distribute the securities to investors. If Kuhn Loeb would not participate and other firms followed its lead, the offering could not be brought to market on acceptable terms. Schiff's opposition did not need to be coercive. His commercial relationships made his position sufficient. The Russian finance ministry filed diplomatic complaints about Schiff's activities with the American State Department. The complaints acknowledged that a private banker was conducting what amounted to an unofficial economic blockade of a sovereign government. The State Department noted the complaints and took no action. Schiff was not violating any law. He was exercising his commercial judgment about which clients he would serve. The capital market campaign reached its most dramatic expression in 1911. The United States had maintained a commercial treaty with Russia since 1832, one of the oldest bilateral trade agreements in American diplomatic history. Schiff identified a specific violation within it. The treaty guaranteed that American citizens traveling in Russia would be treated equally regardless of religion. The Russian government was refusing to honor American passports held by Jewish citizens, denying them entry or restricting their movement on arrival. Schiff argued that the treaty was therefore invalid and should be abrogated. He did not file a legal complaint. He launched a national political campaign. He lobbied members of Congress directly. He organized Jewish community organizations across the country to petition their representatives. He met with President Taft personally and pressed the case. Taft was resistant. The State Department considered the treaty diplomatically important and did not want to antagonize Russia over what it characterized as a minority rights question. Schiff was unmoved. In December 1911, Congress passed a joint resolution abrogating the 1832 treaty. Taft signed it despite his personal reluctance. The oldest commercial treaty in American diplomatic history was canceled, at the insistence of a private banker. Russia lost its most favored nation trading status with the United States. The Russian finance ministry had watched Schiff block their bond offerings for over a decade. Now he had canceled their diplomatic trading framework as well. The second dimension of the anti-Tsar operation was the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom. This was a transatlantic organization founded in the 1890s with branches in New York and London. Its stated purpose was to support democratic reform in Russia. Schiff was among its American financial backers. His associate George Kennan, a journalist and Russia expert, was among its most active organizers. During the Russo-Japanese War, the society identified an opportunity. Japan had captured tens of thousands of Russian soldiers and sailors. These men were held in prison camps across Japan. The society arranged for the printing and distribution of revolutionary literature, pamphlets, newspapers, and political materials, to be delivered into the camps. The specific content matters because it is documented and because it directly contradicts the conspiracy theory that Schiff was funding Bolshevik revolution. The materials distributed were not communist propaganda. They were democratic reform literature, pamphlets explaining the Russian constitutional reform movement, the program of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which advocated for a democratic republic, not a communist dictatorship, materials comparing Russian autocracy with Western democratic governance, and accounts of the 1905 revolution and its demands. The objective was to produce soldiers who would return to Russia believing in constitutional democracy, not soldiers who would support a Marxist seizure of power. The distinction between these two objectives is the key to understanding both what Schiff was actually doing and why the Bolshevik conspiracy theory is historically wrong. The documentation of this operation was recorded by George Kennan himself at a public meeting. Speaking at a gathering of the Friends of Russian Freedom in April 1905, he described what had been accomplished in specific and unambiguous terms. He told the audience that a New York banker, the description was understood by everyone present to refer to Schiff, had arranged for 1.5 tons of Russian revolutionary propaganda to reach Japanese prison camps. The material included pamphlets on Russian constitutional history, the program of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and materials explaining the principles of democratic government. Kennan stated that at the end of the war, 50,000 Russian officers and men returned to their country as ardent revolutionists. He described these returning soldiers as 50,000 seeds of liberty planted in 100 Russian regiments. His words were recorded and published. They appear in the proceedings of the meeting and were subsequently cited in multiple press accounts. The operation was not a secret. Schiff and Kennan discussed it openly in the context of what they considered a legitimate campaign for human rights against an oppressive regime. 50,000 soldiers returned to Russia carrying political material they had studied in Japanese prison camps. They returned to an army that had just suffered a humiliating military defeat at the hands of an Asian power. The combination of political radicalization and military humiliation would prove explosive in 1905 and would not be fully resolved when it produced its final consequences in 1917. The Tsar's government was simultaneously being starved of capital from the West and seeded with opposition from within its own military. The financial and the ideological operations ran in parallel from the same New York network. The Russo-Japanese War ended in September 1905 with the Treaty of Portsmouth. Japan had won. Russia had lost. The military defeat and the economic exhaustion of the war combined with years of internal pressure to produce the revolution of 1905, a nationwide wave of strikes, mutinies, and popular uprisings that nearly brought down the Tsarist regime a decade before it actually fell. The revolution failed in its immediate objective. The Tsar survived. He granted a constitution and a parliament, the Duma, as a concession to the uprising. Then he spent the next decade steadily reasserting autocratic control and walking back the constitutional promises he had made under pressure. The Duma was dissolved twice in its first 2 years when it proved too independent of Tsarist control. The constitutional experiment became a managed consultation rather than genuine democratic government. But the mutinies in the Russian military during the 1905 revolution had a specific character that contemporaries noted. The Black Sea Fleet mutiny, later dramatized in the film Battleship Potemkin, involved sailors who had been captured by Japan during the war and released. Similar patterns appeared in army units, where returned prisoners formed the nuclei of protest organizations. The connection was not invisible at the time. Russian military intelligence filed reports noting the politicization of returned prisoners. The Ukraina, the Tsarist secret police, tracked the distribution of revolutionary materials in the camps and identified the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom as a source. Schiff monitored the 1905 revolution closely from New York. His correspondence from this period shows a man calculating whether the constitutional concessions represented genuine change or tactical retreat. He concluded it was the latter. The capital market pressure continued. The decade between 1905 and 1917 was one in which the Tsarist system accumulated its final contradictions. Russia fought the First World War from 1914 onward, with an economy denied access to American capital markets for over a decade. The war cost Russia catastrophically. 4 million casualties by 1916, economic near collapse, and the exhaustion of a regime that had never resolved the structural weaknesses exposed in 1905. In February 1917, the regime collapsed. The Tsar abdicated on the 15th of March. Within days, Schiff sent his telegram to the Carnegie Hall celebration. The words he used, what we had hoped and striven for these long years, were not rhetorical. They were an accurate description of a systematic 15-year campaign whose documented instruments included $200 million in Japanese war bonds. A sustained campaign to deny Russia access to Western capital. And the distribution of revolutionary material to 50,000 Russian soldiers. The story that Schiff's telegram celebrates has a second chapter that he did not anticipate and did not want. The March Revolution that removed the Tsar brought to power the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky. This was the outcome Schiff had worked toward, a democratic Russia that would end the legal persecution of Jewish citizens and integrate into the Western constitutional order. Schiff immediately lifted his long-standing prohibition on loans to Russia. Kuhn Loeb extended credit to the Kerensky government. Schiff wrote enthusiastically to the New York Times that the Russian nation had at last effected what a great and good people deserved. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Kerensky government. Vladimir Lenin, returning from exile on a sealed German railway carriage, and Leon Trotsky led a second revolution that replaced the democratic provisional government with a communist dictatorship. The democratic Russia that Schiff had worked toward for 15 years lasted 8 months. Schiff opposed the Bolsheviks immediately and completely. He refused to extend any credit to the new Soviet government. He publicly condemned the October Revolution as a disaster. He supported anti-Bolshevik forces in the Russian Civil War through charitable organizations and political lobbying. The man who had celebrated the Tsar's fall in March was issuing statements against the Bolsheviks by December. His biographer Cyrus Adler, who had access to his private correspondence, documented this reversal in detail. Schiff's gripe against Russia had been its anti-Semitism. The Bolsheviks represented a different kind of authoritarian danger, and he wanted no part of it. The conspiracy theory that Schiff funded the Bolshevik Revolution, a claim that circulated in anti-Semitic literature from the 1920s onward and was used extensively in Nazi propaganda, is contradicted by the documented record of his actions in the second half of 1917. He opposed the Bolsheviks. He supported their opponents. The confusion arose partly because the March Revolution and the October Revolution were different events with different outcomes, and partly because the documented story of his role in the March Revolution was real enough that bad faith actors could distort it into a false account of his role in October. What Schiff actually funded was the downfall of the Tsar, not the rise of Lenin. The distinction matters both historically and morally. He was motivated by the defense of Jewish civil rights against state persecution, not by ideological sympathy with communism. The outcome he achieved was the one he stated publicly he was working toward. The outcome that followed was not one he intended or supported. He died in September 1920. He was 73 years old. The Russian Civil War was still being fought. The Soviet state he had not built was consolidating the power he had not intended to give it. The democratic Russia he had worked 15 years to create had existed for 8 months. The financial operation Jacob Schiff conducted between 1904 and 1917 is documented without serious dispute. The Japan loans are in Takahashi's memoirs and in multiple banking archives. The capital market isolation is documented in the records of the American capital market. The prison camp propaganda operation is documented in George Kennan's own public statement. The Carnegie Hall telegram is in the New York Times archive for the 24th of March, 1917. The standard account of the Russo-Japanese War teaches that Japan surprised the world by defeating a European empire. The standard account of the Russian Revolution teaches that it was a spontaneous popular uprising against an oppressive regime. Both accounts are true as far as they go. Neither one explains the Wall Street office from which a private banker spent 15 years engineering the financial conditions that made both outcomes possible. What the documents show is that Schiff operated at 2 points of maximum leverage. The Japanese bond market in 1904 was a genuine choke point. Takahashi had been turned down by every major British banking house before he met Schiff at that London dinner. Without the Kuhn Loeb commitment, it is not clear that the Japanese war financing would have come together on the terms and timeline it did. The propaganda operation targeted men who were already disaffected by military defeat and who would return to a country entering political crisis. The capital market isolation increased Russia's borrowing costs and reduced its financial flexibility at precisely the moment it needed both. None of these operations was decisive on its own. Taken together across 15 years, they represent a sustained and sophisticated financial campaign against a sovereign government conducted from a private office on Wall Street. The objective Schiff stated publicly in 1904 was achieved in March 1917. The Tsar fell. The New York Times published his telegram saying it was the realization of what he had worked for. The Schiff papers are at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. The Takahashi memoirs are in the Japanese National Archives. George Kennan's statement is in the published records of the Friends of Russian Freedom. The Rothschild Archive in London holds the banking correspondence documenting the Japanese war bond syndication. The Russian Finance Ministry diplomatic complaints are in the National Archives in Washington. The paper trail is open. It has been open for over a century. Jacob Schiff died in September 1920. He was 73 years old. He did not live to see what the Russia he helped liberate from the Tsar became under Stalin. The records of what he did remain in 5 archive collections on 2 continents. If this is the kind of forensic financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to the channel. And if this video changed how you think about the forces behind the events that shaped the 20th century, share it with someone who still believes the Russian Revolution was simply a popular uprising. Leave a $sign in the comments if you made it to the end. I will see you in the next one.